Well, the facts of the case are actually very interesting. It concerns a textile manufacturer called Leicester and Harris. There were 3 factories owned by the manufacturer, one in Australia, one in Nuneaton, and the main one in Coventry. The Coventry business was the most profitable, and the other 2 in Nuneaton and Australia dragged the business down. A minority of the shares in Leicester and Harris, in this textile manufacturer, were held by the Phipps family trust. They were at the start of the case anyway. By the end of the case, the trust had ceased to exist and the shares had vested in the beneficiaries as absolute owners. So by the end of the case, the trust no longer exists. At the start of the case, though, it does. The trustees of the Phipps family trust consulted from time to time a solicitor called Thomas Boardman. And Boardman, along with a beneficiary of the trust called Tom Phipps, attended a meeting of this textile manufacturer, Leicester and Harris, with a view to getting Phipps elected on the board. The Phipps Trust only had a minority shareholding, so they couldn't control it, but by getting Phipps on the board, they wanted to have a bit more influence. And they were met with a really frosty reception. It was tense, and they came away unsuccessful. From this point onwards, the 2 men had the bit between their teeth. Ultimately, using their own money borrowed from financiers in London, they bought up Leicester and Harris. And then, using the Phipps shares as well as their own shares, they effectively asset stripped the firm. They sold the Nuneaton site and the site in Australia, and they distributed the capital on the shares. So all the shareholders got a distribution of the value from this asset stripping. Who benefited from this action then? Well, the Phipps family benefited. That's really important. Remember, the trust comes to the end. By the end of the case, the trust no longer exists, but the family members benefit. Capital distributions were paid on the shares. But Boardman and Tom Phipps also benefit because they bought up the shares and then distributed capital on the shares. Note, Tom Phipps benefits twice as a member of the Phipps family, and also because he bought up the shares with Boardman. So everyone's a winner. What was the problem? Well, John Phipps, one of the beneficiaries of the trust, a member of the Phipps family, and Tom Phipps, his brother, objects. As an aside, John Phipps is described rather cruelly in the case. At first instance, where the case is first heard, he's described in these terms: not quick on the uptake, particularly when dealing with financial matters. He was not easy to negotiate with and had a one-track mind. He's compared in the case very, very unfavourably with Boardman, who's described as having conspicuous ability, energy, clarity of mind and persistence. Boardman seems to have been something of a superstar. He eventually becomes elected to Parliament and eventually retires when the Heath government finishes. John Phipps complained that he'd never consented to Boardman and Phipps's scheme. John Phipps said that Boardman and Tom Phipps were in a fiduciary relationship to him. John Phipps said they'd made a profit from the trust. John Phipps then said that they owed a proportion of the profits that they distributed on the shares to themselves, because remember they bought up shares in Leicester and Harris, and the shares themselves on constructive trust for his own benefit. So he said they had to hand over the shares and the profits that they'd made through the capital distribution, a proportion of them anyway, to him. John Phipps won. He got his constructive trust, he got his proportion of the shares owned by Boardman and Tom Phipps, and he got the profits distributed on the shares. So it's a very striking case, because Boardman and Tom Phipps had made a profit for everyone. Everyone had won through the scheme. John Phipps seems a bit ungrateful. He benefited from Boardman and Phipps asset stripping, But despite the fact that John Phipps had benefited, he was still allowed at law to go further and take a share of Boardman and Tom Phipps shares, and the profits distributed on those shares as well. So, how was that possible? Well, the first leg to the claim is that Boardman and Tom Phipps owed John Phipps fiduciary obligations. What was the path to that claim, that Tom Phipps and Boardman owed John Phipps obligations? Well, the first route and the sole focus in the lower courts was agency. John Phipps said that Boardman and Tom Phipps were acting on behalf of the trust. They were agents of the trust. A problem with this line of argument is that although at points they may have been, so for example when they first attended the meeting at Leicester and Harris and tried to get Tom Phipps elected to the board, there was no contract of agency. It's difficult to say there was an ongoing relationship of agency in this case. Although judges have different emphases, the majority seem to work on that basis, but there was no contract of agency. The other route, the other way of establishing a fiduciary relationship, was first raised by Lord Denning in the Court of Appeal. Remember, this case went all the way up to the House of Lords, and it was developed in the House of Lords. Boardman was a solicitor, and he was a solicitor who worked as and when for the Phipps Family Trust. All solicitors owe duties to their clients, and so the fiduciary duties in the House of Lords anyway were treated as arising because they flowed from Boardman's position as a solicitor to the trust. There were problems with this too, though. Boardman did not have a contract with the trust. He was no retainer. He was just consulted as and when. So why was there an ongoing fiduciary relationship? Another problem is that Tom Phipps was not a solicitor. Remember, he was a beneficiary of the trust. So the majority of the House of Lords get around this in a rather clunking and unsuccessful way by describing him as a co-adventurer. Just because he's a co-adventurer, why does that mean he also owes fiduciary obligations? But that's the basis on which the House of Lords proceeded. So we've asked what was the fiduciary relationship, and our next question then is what was the breach? So if we've accepted this fiduciary relationship, what did they do wrong? It's not enough for there just to be a fiduciary relationship. There also has to be a breach. I think it's helpful to go back to Lord Upjohn's principle. Remember, there's a fundamental rule of equity that a person in a fiduciary capacity must not make a profit out of his trust. He says, which is part of the wider rule, that a trustee must not place himself in a position where his duty and his interest may conflict. Lord Upjohn can perhaps be criticised here for treating making a profit from a trust and putting oneself in a position where duty and interest conflict as if they are a single thing. Perhaps it makes more sense to split them up. Let's do that. So if we start with the claim that they made a profit, well, it's quite clear that they did. That profit was not authorised. John Phipps never consented to the arrangement. There was disagreement over that. But in the first instance, Mr. Justice Wilberforce, when the case first came to court, found that John Phipps had never consented. So if you think they were fiduciaries, remember this is a difficult point, then there was breach because they made a profit. Let's move on then to the separate question. We're treating this as a separate question, and that's whether or not there was a conflict of duty and interest. It's actually, in my view, more difficult to maintain there was a conflict of duty and interest. Boardman, as a solicitor, did owe duties of impartial advice, But as a matter of fact, he was never asked by the trustees whether or not the trust should buy the shares. And that's the only point at which there might be a conflict of duty and interest if the Phipps family trust had wanted to buy the shares for themselves. In fact, that would have been legally impossible because of the terms of the trust instrument. Because Boardman was never actually asked by the trust about whether the trust should buy the shares, it follows that any conflict of duty and interest was entirely hypothetical. Entirely hypothetical, not real. And this led Lord Upjohn to say, I cannot see that they have, that is, Boardman and Tom Phipps, from start to finish, in the circumstances of this case, placed themselves in a position where there was any possibility of a conflict between their duty and their interest. Lord Upjohn was right. There was no real possibility. There was only a hypothetical one. However, we have seen that there was an unauthorised profit. Remember, Lord Upjohn treats profit and conflict as the same thing, but if we separate them out like we just have done, we might take a different view from him. And so finally then, what are the policy implications of this case? Well, it's an extremely well-known case. It's extremely well cited. It's extremely common case used in court, referenced in textbooks, academic writing. It's an extremely well-known case. And it's given this very broad meaning. And the judges in the House of Lords will have intended that. It's taken to mean that where there's a conflict of interest, even a hypothetical one, or where there is unauthorised profits, then fiduciaries must hand them over. The case in its way is controversial too, because many people feel sympathy for Boardman. Remember, he benefited everyone, including himself. And John Phipps is sometimes described negatively as someone who wanted his cake and to eat it. John Phipps took his own profits from the work of Boardman and Tom Phipps, and then went after the shares and profits of Boardman and Tom Phipps as well. So why do we have such a strict rule? Why was John Phipps allowed to win? An academic called Michael Conaglan perhaps has the answer. He describes the law in this area as prophylactic. What he means is it kills the temptation to profit dead. The idea is, if not Boardman himself, people like Boardman, in positions like Boardman, need to be stopped from acting in a self-interested way. So the idea goes, if they're allowed to seek out profits for themselves, they might be tempted to betray the people to whom they owe fiduciary obligations. And so Boardman was sacrificed to this prophylactic principle. A hard rule, tough for Boardman, but good as a general principle because it stops people seeking out profits for themselves when perhaps they shouldn't. Just to end the tale, it's important to note that Boardman didn't come away with nothing actually. The House of Lords ordered that he should be paid an allowance for his work. So although he had to hand over his shares and the profits distributed on the shares, he was paid a separate allowance for the work that he did. All the judges took pains to say that he had acted honestly and it didn't harm his career. Remember, he was eventually a very successful politician.